Alex Ventura is a reserved yet fiercely intelligent student of occultism, driven by an insatiable curiosity for the forbidden. Ever since childhood, Alex has been haunted by vivid dreams of shadowy figures whispering secrets in a language he could never understand. These dreams fueled his obsession with ancient texts, leading him to drop out of conventional university to pursue arcane knowledge in isolation. His world is confined to a crumbling mansion on a hill, a relic of a forgotten era, where time seems to stand still. The mansion's faded grandeur is overshadowed by its unsettling aura. Walls covered in peeling wallpaper depict faded landscapes, and the floorboards groan under the weight of a silence so thick it feels alive. The mansion was abandoned decades ago, shrouded in local rumors of strange rituals performed by its last owner, a reclusive occultist who vanished without a trace. When Alex stumbled upon the property, it was as if it called to him. The front door creaked open on its own, revealing a labyrinthine interior littered with dust-coated artifacts and an oppressive darkness that swallowed light. Alex took it as a sign, a perfect sanctuary for his studies. The house became his world, its chilling atmosphere sharpening his focus on deciphering forgotten languages and collecting manuscripts rumored to contain the whispers of otherworldly entities. Late one stormy night, as rain lashed against the stained-glass windows, Alex was drawn to a peculiar draft coming from a section of the mansion's sprawling library. The wind carried an almost inaudible hum, rhythmic and hypnotic, like a chant buried beneath the sound of the storm. Following the sound, Alex discovered a hidden panel in the wall, its edges marked with unfamiliar symbols carved deep into the wood. With trembling fingers, he pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The air grew colder with each step, the faint hum transforming into a guttural growl as he descended into the darkness below. At the base of the stairs was a locked iron door, its surface engraved with glyphs that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Alex's breath quickened as he traced the sigils with his fingertips, feeling a strange warmth emanate from them. In the dim light of his lantern, he noticed a keyhole shaped like an inverted triangle. Miraculously, one of his many relics, a key he had found years ago at an obscure estate sale, fit perfectly. The door groaned open, releasing a gust of icy wind that extinguished his lantern, plunging him into total darkness. Inside, Alex discovered an ancient chest wrapped in chains so corroded they crumbled at his touch. As he lifted the lid, an overwhelming stench of sulfur and decay filled the air, nearly causing him to retch. Within the chest lay a single book, its cover made of what looked like aged, stretched leather, etched with unrecognizable symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. The book emitted a faint, pulsating glow, as though it were breathing. Its presence felt oppressive, like a pair of unseen eyes boring into his soul. The title, written in a spidery script, revealed itself as the Book of Condemned Souls when Alex dared to light a match. The flickering light illuminated not only the book but also the walls of the room, which were inscribed with thousands of names that seemed to whisper in unison as Alex stared in horror. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, echoing voice. "Read, and you will understand." Paralyzed by a mixture of terror and intrigue, Alex took the book and ascended back to the library. As he opened it, the rain outside ceased abruptly, and an unnatural stillness enveloped the mansion. The first page bore a warning written in crimson ink. To summon the damned is to forfeit control. To read further is to accept your fate. But Alex's curiosity overpowered his fear. With shaking hands, he turned the page, unknowingly setting into motion events that would unravel his sanity and lead him into the darkest recesses of human understanding, and beyond. As the storm outside roared like a living beast, lightning illuminated the mansion's crumbling walls and the sinister contours of the library. Alex sat alone at an ancient oak desk, its surface scarred by years of misuse, the air thick with the acrid smell of damp wood and mildew. The Book of Condemned Souls rested before him, its cover seemingly pulsating under the dim glow of a single candle. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to abandon the cursed object, but his hands moved as if guided by an unseen force. When Alex opened the book, the room felt instantly heavier, as though the air had been sucked out. The candle flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed along the walls, mimicking movements that were not his own. The first page, blank moments before, now revealed a single line etched in deep, crimson ink, "Speak and awaken them." A chill ran down his spine as the words shifted, twisting into a language Alex had only seen in fragments during his studies. Against his better judgment, he began to read aloud, his voice trembling as he uttered the guttural syllables. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost spreading across the windows in jagged, unnatural patterns. Alex's breath became visible, each exhale clouding the air like smoke. The candle's light dimmed to an eerie blue, and the sound of the storm outside faded, replaced by a low, resonant hum. It was not the hum of machinery or nature. It was organic, almost like a heartbeat, reverberating through the floorboards and up into Alex's chest. As he completed the incantation, a sudden crash echoed from the far corner of the library. Alex spun around, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Books tumbled from the shelves, falling open to pages depicting grotesque illustrations of twisted, inhuman forms. One by one, the books seemed to push themselves free, as if something unseen was rifling through them in search of something or someone. The hum grew louder, escalating into a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The voices spoke in overlapping tongues, each more incomprehensible than the last, but Alex could feel their meaning pressing into his mind like jagged shards of glass. We see you. We know you. You are ours. A cold sweat broke out across his body as the shadows on the walls coalesced, taking on humanoid forms. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. One of the shadow figures stepped forward, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, as though it were studying him. Its eyes, or the voids where eyes should have been, seemed to pierce directly into Alex's soul. "Who dares disturb the veil?" the figure hissed, its voice layered with tones both deep and shrill, as if multiple beings spoke through it at once. Alex froze, his mouth dry, unable to answer. The shadow stepped closer, its form shifting like smoke, tendrils of darkness reaching out toward him. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Alex slammed the book shut. The instant the cover closed, the shadows evaporated, and the whispers ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. He sat motionless, his chest heaving as he struggled to process what had just happened. But the reprieve was brief. The silence was broken by the faint sound of scratching, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Alex turned toward the source, his eyes wide with terror. The book was vibrating on the desk, its cover now glowing faintly, the etched symbols shifting like living things. The scratching grew louder, evolving into the unmistakable sound of nails clawing at wood, as if something on the other side of reality was trying to break through. Alex stood, his chair toppling backward, as the library door slammed shut on its own. He was trapped. The candle extinguished, plunging the room into darkness save for the ominous glow of the book. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, their words now intelligible. "You open the door. You cannot close it." In that moment, Alex realized his mistake. He hadn't just read from an old book, he had invited something into his world, something ancient and insatiable. The book was no longer an object. It was a portal, a beacon calling to forces beyond his comprehension. And they were coming. The library was silent, but it was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. It was thick, oppressive, filled with the sensation that something was waiting just out of sight. Alex felt it in his chest, a weight pressing down, making each breath feel labored. He tried to calm himself, but his hands betrayed him, trembling uncontrollably as he reached for the book again. The air had grown colder, but there was an electric charge to it, as though the room itself had begun to awaken. Reluctantly, Alex reopened the Book of Condemned Souls. The pages, once blank save for the blood-red warnings, were now alive with shifting text and unsettling illustrations. One page depicted a figure standing in a circle surrounded by shadowy, clawed hands reaching inward. The caption below read, "The circle protects, until it does not." His pulse quickened, but his curiosity dragged him further into the book. As he turned the page, the air around him grew heavier, and a faint metallic taste filled his mouth. He gagged, feeling as though he'd swallowed something foreign. The text on the new page shimmered, then seemed to burn into his vision, the letters searing into his mind even as he struggled to look away. The whispers returned, louder now, and they were no longer incoherent. They called his name. "Alex! Alex, you see us now." The words on the page described a ritual to summon a watcher spirit, a supposed observer of realms beyond human comprehension. The instructions were intricate, involving specific placements of candles and symbols, along with an incantation to be recited exactly as written. Against his better judgment, Alex began to prepare. He told himself it was for research, a test to understand the power of the book, but deep down he knew it was more than that. He felt compelled, as though the book itself demanded it. The ritual began. The candles flickered erratically, their flames unnaturally elongated, twisting as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. Alex stood within the protective circle, his voice shaking as he chanted the words aloud. Each syllable felt like a knife slicing through the fabric of reality, the air around him vibrating with an unnatural frequency. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, like the low moan of distant wind, but it grew, shifting into something primal and guttural, a sound that didn't belong in the natural world. It was accompanied by a scratching noise, as if something massive and clawed was moving just outside the edges of his vision. The room darkened further, the candlelight dimming until only the faint glow of the book remained. Shadows pooled at the edges of the circle, writhing and coalescing into shapes. One of them moved closer, its form undefined yet unmistakably alive. It towered over Alex, its presence overwhelming, its very essence pressing against the boundaries of his protective circle. "Watch your spirit," Alex whispered, barely able to force the words from his throat. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, clutching the book to his chest like a lifeline. The shadow leaned closer, its featureless face mere inches from his own. Then it spoke, its voice a chorus of agony and rage. "You brought me here. Now look." Before Alex could react, the shadows dissolved into the floor, and the room was consumed by an unnatural darkness. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no light, only the suffocating weight of the void. Then the visions began. Alex saw flashes of grotesque scenes, as though the spirit was forcing him to witness its world. In one, an endless wasteland stretched before him, littered with the skeletal remains of creatures he couldn't recognize. In another, he stood before an ancient monolith, its surface carved with symbols identical to those on the book. The final vision was the most horrifying. Alex saw himself, his body twisted and broken, his face locked in a silent scream as shadowy hands pulled him into the abyss. The darkness lifted abruptly, and Alex found himself back in the library, gasping for air. The protective circle was gone, the candles extinguished, and the book lay open before him, its pages blank once more. But the room was not the same. Scratches covered the walls, jagged and chaotic, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Then he saw it. On the far side of the room, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was humanoid but distorted, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It didn't move, but Alex could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. He blinked, and it was gone. The whispers returned, softer now but more insistent. "This is only the beginning." Alex knew then that he had crossed a line. The Watcher spirit was no longer bound to the circle or the book. It was free. And it wasn't alone. The air in the mansion felt heavier with each passing second, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Alex stood frozen, his eyes locked on the now blank pages of the Book of Condemned Souls. He wanted to believe it was over, that the horrors had subsided, but the tension in the room told a different story. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting imperceptibly, and every creak of the floorboards felt like an unseen entity taking its first step toward him. Then the sound began, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the house. It wasn't coming from any single direction. It was everywhere at once, vibrating in his bones. The book snapped shut on its own, sending a deafening echo through the room. The candles, long extinguished, suddenly reignited with a cold, unnatural blue flame, casting eerie light on the warped walls. Alex turned to run, but the door to the library slammed shut with a violent force, trapping him. He tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the growling grew louder, now accompanied by the faint sound of whispers. He turned back toward the book, only to find it levitating above the desk, spinning slowly as pages flipped wildly, seemingly on their own. Symbols and illustrations began to emerge on the pages, written in an ink that glowed like molten fire. The whispers intensified, forming discernible words. "You wanted knowledge. Now you will see." The book stopped spinning abruptly, slamming down onto the desk with a force that shook the entire room. The symbols on its cover burned brighter, illuminating a circle of runes that appeared on the floor around Alex. Before he could react, the circle flared to life, trapping him within its glowing boundary. From the circle, tendrils of darkness began to rise, writhing like living shadows. They stretched and twisted, forming grotesque shapes, faces that screamed silently, hands that clawed at the air, and eyes that glowed with malevolent intent. One of the tendrils reached for Alex, brushing against his arm. It was cold, so cold it burned, and the sensation sent a searing pain through his entire body. "Stop! I didn't mean." Alex's voice broke as the tendrils began to close in. His protests were drowned out by a deafening roar, a sound so deep it felt like the house itself was screaming. From within the shadows, a figure began to emerge. It was the Watcher spirit, but now its form was fully realized. Its elongated limbs stretched impossibly, and its face was a blank void, save for a jagged, tooth-filled mouth that twisted into a grotesque grin. It towered over Alex, its presence oppressive, suffocating. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of overlapping tones, each one more horrifying than the last. "You called us here, Seeker," it hissed. "And now we will show you what lies beyond the veil." Alex tried to step back, but the glowing runes on the floor burned brighter, holding him in place. The Watcher raised one skeletal hand, and the shadows around him seemed to obey its command, coiling tighter around Alex's body. His vision blurred, and the room around him began to shift. The library dissolved, replaced by a vast, desolate landscape shrouded in eternal twilight. The ground was made of blackened, cracked earth that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Towering spires of jagged stone loomed in the distance, each one adorned with twisted, writhing figures frozen in agony. The sky above was a swirling maelstrom of dark clouds and flickering red lightning, casting brief, terrifying glimpses of shapes moving within the storm. Alex realized he wasn't alone. All around him were figures, human, or at least they had been. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams, and their bodies were contorted in unnatural poses, as if they had been frozen mid-torment. They reached out to him, their movements slow and agonizing, their hands grasping for salvation he couldn't provide. The Watcher spirit stood beside him, its presence even more imposing in this otherworldly plane. "This is where the knowledge you seek is born," it said, its voice echoing through the desolation. "Every question has a price. Are you prepared to pay it?" Alex shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't know. I didn't want this." The spirit tilted its head, its grin widening. "Ignorance does not absolve you." With a wave of its hand, the shadows around Alex began to rise, twisting into grotesque shapes. They were faces he recognized. His own face, staring back at him, distorted and broken, screaming silently as they multiplied, surrounding him in a nightmarish loop of self-damnation. Suddenly, Alex was back in the library, collapsing to the floor in a heap. The runes on the floor were gone, the book lay closed and silent on the desk, and the candles were extinguished once more. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the silence of a predator watching its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alex looked down at his arm and gasped. The symbol from the Watcher spirit's world was now burned into his skin, glowing faintly as if alive. The whispers returned, softer this time but no less chilling. "You've only just begun, Alex. The veil is thin, and we are always watching." Alex staggered to his feet, his legs trembling, and ran from the library. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping what he had unleashed. The book had marked him, and the shadows would follow him wherever he went. The following morning, Alex awoke in his bed, drenched in sweat, his body trembling from the vivid horrors of the previous night. For a fleeting moment, he thought it might have been a nightmare, a figment of his overstimulated imagination. But as his eyes adjusted to the pale morning light streaming through the cracked blinds, he noticed the faint, glowing symbol on his forearm. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, as if it were alive. His breath caught in his throat, and the room seemed to shrink around him. The memory of the Watcher spirit's voice echoed in his mind. "The veil is thin, and we are always watching." He pulled his sleeve down hastily, as if hiding the mark could somehow erase its reality. But the unease in his chest only deepened as he stood and noticed something strange. His room was subtly wrong. The furniture appeared slightly off-kilter, as if the angles of the room had shifted in ways his eyes couldn't fully comprehend. His books, once meticulously organized, were now scattered across the floor, their pages fluttering as if an invisible wind had disturbed them. The Book of Condemned Souls was not among them. A wave of cold panic washed over Alex as he realized it was missing. He tore through the room, overturning stacks of papers, throwing open drawers, and checking every crevice, but the book was nowhere to be found. A faint noise broke the silence, a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. Alex froze, his eyes darting toward the window. At first, he saw nothing but the overcast sky and the gnarled branches of the dead tree outside. But then he noticed it, a dark silhouette standing motionless at the edge of the forest that bordered the mansion. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but Alex felt its gaze, cold and unrelenting, as if it could see straight into his soul. Desperate for answers, Alex ventured back into the library. The room was exactly as he had left it the night before, dark, suffocating, and eerily silent. The scratches on the walls were still there, their jagged edges seeming to form a chaotic pattern that made his head throb if he looked too closely. He traced his fingers over them, the grooves cold and unnaturally smooth, as if carved by something other than human hands. Suddenly, his fingers caught on something, a loose panel in the wall, hidden among the scratches. With a deep breath, Alex pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a stack of aged, brittle papers, along with an old photograph. He carefully unfolded the photograph and was struck by what he saw. A group of people standing in the very library where he now stood, their faces partially obscured by the dim light of an unseen source. His eyes widened as he recognized the face of one man in the group. It was the previous owner of the mansion, the reclusive occultist who had vanished decades ago. But what truly made Alex's stomach churn was the book cradled in the man's hands, the Book of Condemned Souls. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note in spidery, erratic script. The book does not belong to us. It belongs to them. Each name written here is another soul claimed. I was the last. You are the next. The realization struck Alex like a thunderclap. He wasn't the first to encounter the book, nor would he be the last. It was a trap, a cursed artifact that lured in the curious and the desperate, feeding off their souls to sustain the horrors within. His name was now part of the book's legacy, etched into the invisible fabric of its curse. Before he could fully process the discovery, the tapping noise returned, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the window anymore, it was inside the mansion. The rhythmic sound echoed through the corridors, growing faster, more erratic, as if something was racing toward him. Alex grabbed the stack of papers and bolted from the library, his heart pounding. As he ran down the hallway, the lights flickered violently, plunging him into moments of complete darkness. In the flashes of light, he caught glimpses of movement, shadowy figures darting just beyond his line of sight, their forms shifting and distorting with each step he took. Reaching his room, he slammed the door shut and pressed his back against it, his chest heaving. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint whispering that seemed to seep through the walls. He unfolded the papers he had taken from the hidden compartment, scanning the scrawled text for anything that could help him. The notes described rituals, warnings, and desperate attempts to destroy the book, all of which had failed. One passage stood out, written in bolder strokes as if the author had been overcome by desperation. The book is not destroyed, it is returned. It seeks the next. Do not read further, for each word draws them closer. As Alex read the final line, the whispers grew louder, now distinct voices calling his name. The symbol on his arm flared to life, burning like a brand, and his vision blurred. In that moment, he knew the truth. The book hadn't disappeared. It was still in the house, waiting, watching. And no matter where he ran, it would find him. Alex's world was unraveling. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred into a suffocating haze, and every moment felt like a descent deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. The whispers were relentless now, faint during the day but deafening at night. They spoke his name, repeated fragments of rituals, and sometimes cried out in voices so tortured they left him trembling. The symbol on his arm continued to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat, a constant reminder that the book's curse was far from over. Desperate for answers, Alex ventured into the mansion's labyrinthine depths, searching for anything that might explain the horror he was trapped in. Armed with a flashlight and trembling resolve, he descended into the cellar, a part of the house he had avoided until now. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the stench of mildew and something far worse, something rotting. The cellar was vast and unnervingly silent, save for the distant drip of water echoing in the darkness. Its walls were lined with decayed wooden shelves, cluttered with jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room stood a heavy stone altar, its surface darkened with stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. The altar was surrounded by faint carvings, symbols similar to those in the Book of Condemned Souls. Alex approached cautiously, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Resting on the altar was a single object that made his blood run cold, a blackened mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked, yet faintly reflective. As he peered into it, his own reflection twisted and distorted, his features stretching into a grotesque, unrecognizable mockery of himself. "Why are you here?" The voice came from nowhere, reverberating in the small space. Alex spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grasp. The cellar was empty, but the voice persisted, low and guttural, dripping with malice. "You seek what you cannot undo." The mirror's surface rippled like liquid, and Alex's reflection disappeared, replaced by a horrific scene. He saw himself standing in the library, surrounded by the shadowy figures that had haunted him. But in the vision, his eyes were hollow, his expression vacant, as if his soul had been drained. The Watcher spirit loomed behind him, its jagged grin widening as it placed a clawed hand on his shoulder. "Stop this!" Alex screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. But the vision didn't fade, it intensified. He saw flashes of people he didn't recognize, all seemingly connected to the book. Some were performing rituals, others were consumed by fire, and one man was dragged into the shadows by unseen hands, his screams echoing into nothingness. The voice returned, now sharper, filled with scorn. "The book does not choose the curious. It chooses the broken. You are no different." Tears streamed down Alex's face as he backed away from the mirror, its surface finally stilling. He knew the voice was right. His obsession with the occult, his hunger for knowledge, had made him an easy target. But the realization did nothing to quell the terror clawing at his mind. He turned to leave, but the cellar door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into total darkness. The whispers returned, louder and closer than ever, surrounding him. Alex stumbled forward, feeling his way along the damp, crumbling walls, but the space seemed endless, stretching far beyond its physical dimensions. The air grew heavier, and a low growl resonated through the darkness, vibrating in his chest. Alex froze as a faint light appeared in the distance, a sickly green glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was coming from the altar. Against his better judgment, he turned back, drawn to the light despite every instinct screaming at him to run. The mansion was no longer just a house. It had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, twisting and shifting as if alive. Alex stumbled through the darkened corridors, clutching the stack of brittle papers he'd taken from the hidden compartment. The whispers had evolved into voices, distinct, malevolent, and cruel. They spoke his name in a chorus, each syllable a dagger slicing into his sanity. He reached the grand hall, where the moonlight seeped through fractured stained-glass windows, painting the room in eerie, fragmented colors. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the silence. But Alex knew it wasn't water. It was the house bleeding, its essence leaking into the real world as the boundaries between dimensions frayed. In the center of the hall stood a figure, a grotesque amalgamation of human and shadow. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, and its head twisted at an impossible angle. The Watcher spirit, its hollow eyes locked onto Alex, radiating an ancient, otherworldly malice. The creature raised one skeletal hand, and the whispers silenced abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive stillness. "You cannot escape," the spirit hissed, its voice layered with hundreds of other voices, each one dripping with contempt. "You open the door, Seeker. Now you must pay the price." Alex staggered backward, his mind racing for a way out. The papers in his hand rustled as he flipped through them desperately, searching for anything, any spell, any ritual, that might save him. His eyes landed on a passage scrawled in frantic handwriting. The circle must be completed. Only within the seal can the veil be restored. He didn't have time to think. The Watcher took a step forward, and the ground beneath its feet cracked, sending jagged fissures through the wooden floor. Shadows poured out of the cracks like liquid, crawling toward Alex with unnatural speed. He dropped to his knees, drawing a crude circle on the floor with the chalk he had kept in his pocket for protection. His hands trembled violently, the lines uneven, but he didn't stop. The moment the circle was completed, a blinding light erupted from its edges, forcing the shadows to recoil. The Watcher let out a guttural roar, its elongated arms flailing as the light burned its form. But it wasn't enough. The creature stepped closer, its presence forcing the light to flicker and dim. "Your pitiful protections cannot save you," it sneered, stepping over the circle effortlessly. Alex's heart sank as he realized the truth. The circle wasn't enough. The entity was beyond his comprehension, beyond the rules of reality he thought he understood. But the papers had one last passage. The final sacrifice must be made to close the veil. The meaning hit him like a cold wave. He was the sacrifice. The Watcher loomed over him now, its jagged grin splitting wider as it reached for him. Alex clutched the papers tightly, his mind torn between fear and resolve. He had one last chance to end this. He shouted the incantation written at the bottom of the page, his voice cracking under the strain. The room shook violently, the walls bending inward as if the house itself were imploding. The Watcher froze, its form flickering like a broken projection. "You cannot undo this," it bellowed, its voice now desperate, filled with rage. Alex ignored it, continuing the chant. The symbol on his arm flared with searing heat, the pain nearly unbearable, but he pushed through. The light from the circle expanded, consuming the room in a blinding radiance. The Watcher let out a final, ear-splitting shriek as its form disintegrated, the shadows collapsing into themselves and vanishing into the void. When the light faded, Alex found himself lying on the cold, cracked floor of the hall. The mansion was silent, the oppressive aura gone. He looked at his arm. The symbol had disappeared, leaving only a faint scar. But the book was gone too, leaving behind an empty space where it once rested. As he staggered to his feet, Alex knew he had survived, but he was not free. The Watcher's final words echoed in his mind, "You cannot undo this." And in the silence, he heard it, the faint, familiar sound of tapping coming from the shadows. The book was not destroyed, only dormant, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to find it. The mansion lay in eerie silence, its walls stripped of their oppressive aura, but the victory Alex felt was hollow. The air still carried an unnatural chill, and the faint scent of sulfur lingered, as though the Watcher spirit's presence had not fully dissipated. Alex staggered to his feet, his legs trembling as if the very foundation of his being had been shaken. He looked around the grand hall, now devoid of shadows, and for the first time, he realized how vast and empty it truly was. The faint glow from the circle of runes had faded, leaving only scorch marks on the floor as evidence of the supernatural battle that had unfolded. Alex's gaze fell to the scattered papers at his feet. The text on them had vanished, replaced by blank, yellowed pages, as if the knowledge he had sought had dissolved with the Watcher's defeat. The absence of answers weighed heavily on him. Had he truly succeeded? Or had he merely delayed the inevitable? As Alex stumbled out of the grand hall, he felt an uneasy stillness settle over the mansion. The whispers were gone, and yet the silence felt unnatural, a vacuum that seemed to pull at the edges of his sanity. He passed the shattered remains of the stained glass windows, their fractured pieces casting fragmented rainbows across the cracked floor. But something in their patterns caught his eye, shapes that seemed too deliberate, too precise. It was as if the broken glass was forming symbols, runes he had seen in the book. A shiver ran down his spine as the realization struck him. The book might be gone, but its influence remained. It had woven itself into the fabric of the mansion, perhaps even into Alex himself. The faint scar on his arm throbbed, a reminder that he had been marked, and that such marks were not so easily erased. Making his way to his study, Alex sat heavily at his desk, his mind racing. The Watcher's final words echoed in his ears, "You cannot undo this." He opened his journal, flipping through pages of research, notes, and translations, desperate to find something, anything, that might explain what had happened. But the familiar text now seemed foreign, the symbols incomprehensible. It was as if the knowledge he had once possessed was slipping away, leaving only fragments and questions in its place. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound echoed through the room. Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was coming from the window, the same rhythmic tapping that had haunted him before. Slowly, he turned his head, expecting to see the silhouette of the Watcher spirit. But the window was empty, revealing only the gnarled branches of the dead tree outside swaying gently in the breeze. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Alex realized with dawning horror that it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside the walls. He pressed his ear to the cold plaster, and the sound stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a whisper, faint but unmistakable, "We are still here." Alex stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The walls seemed to ripple, their surface shifting as if something was moving just beneath them. Shadows danced along the edges of his vision, fleeting and impossible to focus on. The house itself felt alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. In his panic, Alex fled the study, the echo of the whispering following him down the corridor. He reached the front door, fumbling with the lock, desperate to escape the mansion and its suffocating presence. But as he threw the door open, he stopped dead in his tracks. The outside world was gone. Instead of the familiar forest and winding path leading away from the mansion, there was nothing but darkness, a void that stretched infinitely in every direction. The only light came from the faint glow of the mansion behind him, its outline distorted and surreal, as if it were a painting smeared by an unseen hand. Alex stepped back, his hands trembling. He was trapped. The mansion wasn't just a physical place anymore. It had become a prison, a realm that existed outside of reality. The book had not been destroyed. It had consumed the house, bending it into a manifestation of its curse. He turned back toward the mansion, his chest heaving with terror. In the dim light, he saw movement at the top of the grand staircase. A figure stood there, tall and shadowy, its face obscured, but its presence unmistakable. The Watcher spirit had returned, and this time it was not alone. Behind it, other figures began to emerge, their forms twisted and grotesque, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The Watcher raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Alex. Its voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "The veil is open. You are the key." Alex fell to his knees, his mind unraveling as the shadows closed in around him. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was the sound of the tapping, growing louder and louder, echoing in perfect rhythm with his racing heartbeat. And then silence. The mansion remains standing to this day, its windows dark, its halls quiet. Locals speak of strange lights seen through the cracks in its walls, of whispers carried on the wind that seem to call out to anyone who strays too close. Some say Alex still walks its corridors, trapped between worlds, searching for a way to undo what he set into motion. Others believe he has become something else entirely, a part of the mansion, a guardian of its secrets, ensuring that no one else dares open the door to the book of condemned souls. But the truth is lost in the shadows, waiting for someone curious or foolish enough to seek it out.